Okay, so yeah, last I left you guys, I basically processed my tile, and I've kind of just created an old folder for that called old layers, which I've hidden, and I've got kind of a snapshot. I just called the base layer tile, and I've saved out. So I usually have, this is my kind of working file, which is the PSD file. Maya can in fact load PSD files directly into it for texture layers, but I find depending on how old your Maya is and how new your Photoshop is, if you got a Photoshop, a version of Photoshop that's like brand new, and a slightly older version of Maya like we do right now, I think they're a bit out of sync. Sometimes it doesn't always recognize the PSD file format. So what I tend to do is I'll go File, Save As. So in this case, I've already saved out a TIFF version of my layer. I tend to prefer TIFF file formats in general for textures, or even for like video sequences coming out of a 3D software. Instead of making like one giant AVI file, I tend to do an image sequence. By the way, when you save a TIFF file, it can actually save layers almost like a PSD does, but in this case I don't want all that extra size and weight, plus all the layers I have are hidden anyways. So I'm going to turn off layers and hit save. So I'm just going to click on my file that I've already saved and save over it just to make sure it's the right one. So I'll replace it. And in Maya, if we kind of come back here, I've got a very basic setup. So I've got excuse me, a blend material, and into the color input, I've got my file loaded in, and I went to the 2D placement node, or place 2D texture node. So that's kind of dictating what happens to the file. So in the place 2D texture node, I've basically repeated it 5 times by 5 times. So next step. So I'll kind of go over 3 types of damage that we can add to this. 3 broader types of damage, I should say. Oh, by the way, I've got another pop-up window here for the TIFF options. So sometimes if you accidentally forget to turn off that initial option of that layers checkbox, you can still tell it in the final step here. There's a couple of windows when you save a TIFF. You can tell it to discard layers here as well. In terms of image compression, never use JPEG. Partly because of compatibility issues, but also JPEG compression. It's a way to shrink a file size, but it produces low quality results. Even if you set it to the highest quality setting, you're always going to lose like a fraction of a percent. And if you resave a TIFF and resave a TIFF and resave a TIFF, eventually those fractions of a percentage points become like 10%, 20%, whatever it is. Zip is okay, but I generally don't use it. There's also LZW, which is kind of the default. I think it stands for like Lempel-Zellwich, which is the name of the 2 or 3 programmers who figured out how to shrink file sizes with no quality loss. So that'll just kind of keep your files a little bit sort of smaller, lighter, more manageable. Or you can go with none. None is totally fine too. It just means larger file sizes. So I'll say okay to that. So that's going to finally save out. So yeah, back to this tile. So I think for this, I'll just kind of go with Google for now. So I'll check out cracks. Let's see. Yeah, I think my safe search results are on, which is good. So again, I tend to go super high res. But one of the complications with this is like if you've got damage or cracks or whatever, you know, you want to be sure that it's kind of the appropriate scale. So if I've got something that's super large or super close up, what's that? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm gonna just check out some cracks. Now, like I said, you want to kind of like sort of look at a few different things. How close is the camera to the cracks? If it's like extremely close up, then it's probably going to be a bit of a mismatch in terms of scaling. Yeah.
Would it be bad to search up like cracked texture, for example? Or?
No, it's not necessarily a bad thing. No.
Just because last night I was looking for brick textures and I ended up coming across like seamless brick textures, and I was like,
yeah, but if you grab a seamless brick texture and if I see that in the originals, you'll just get a 0, which is 40% of the first assignment. So, yeah.
That's why I was concerned about
Yeah, in terms of this, like, there's not a ton of processing needed. I mean, you might, you know, paint out some areas or mask out some areas, but yeah. So this, like I said, sometimes like the type of crack is not exactly what you want. This is mud cracks, which has a very specific look. So if I didn't have like a ground type of texture, I probably wouldn't go with something like that. You can try and look up like, well, as a broader category, masonry. So there's all sorts of yeah, cracks that you'd find in brick and masonry. And of course, if you want to try and hand paint one, there's nothing wrong with that either. So I might try something like this, let's say. Okay, so I'm just going to copy this image. Go to Photoshop. I'm going to just paste this thing down and in. And I'll probably just scale this up until the crack is roughly to scale here. Let me arrange my workspace a bit. There we go. So I usually hold Shift and maybe Alt as well to get up. So Shift, what it does, it keeps things proportional. Here, let me just undo that. So Control T will allow me to get it to transform mode. But as you can see, I can kind of distort the image. I usually never want to distort my images, especially when it comes to textures. So I'll hold Shift to drag from the corner to get it nice and proportional. And if you hold Alt, it'll actually scale from the center of the image. So I'll just do something like that for now. That should be okay. So next up, I basically want to eliminate the whites in the rest of this image. So I'm going to just kind of carefully grab some of the pixels in the crack region. And as you notice, there is this kind of marching ants line. So let me just zoom into this. Control plus to zoom in. So I may in fact want to kind of paint in or out some of this area, because just using the magic wand is not always a great option or a great tool. But you see, it actually has done a fairly decent job of grabbing most of this sort of crack region. So what I'm probably going to do is tweak this and adjust this a bit through what's called quick masking. So in Photoshop, if you notice right over here, there's actually this little button. It looks like a gray sort of square with a little sort of circular dot. So what's cool about that is that if you turn this on, it switches Photoshop to this kind of red and see-through layer. So the stuff that's selected is visible or see-through, and the stuff that you don't want selected sort of shows up in this red preview mode. So this is really like another way of selecting. It's one of the things that's really powerful about Photoshop is the ability to select different types of or different areas of an image. So to paint in or out, of this kind of reddish mask area, we can just simply switch to a regular brush. Again, I'll probably go with something kind of rough here. And if I paint in black, let me just make sure my opacity is maxed out. Usually work at max opacity, so I can essentially paint the selection that I want. So that's really, really useful. So I'm going to just kind of fine-tune this selection like so. And I'm holding space bar and then tablet pen down to excuse me, to brush in or out. So I can switch to a white brush. So remember, D gets you a black and white palette, right, which is over here. So D sets this thing to black, foreground, white, background color, and you're always painting with the foreground. So X will switch back and forth. So that's your kind of primary way to paint in or out in terms of layer masking or in terms of this quick mask. So now I can subtract out that little corner there. Actually, I got too much. There we go. Alright, so for some reason I lost my quick size adjustment shortcut, so I'm just having to go into the menu here. But usually if you use the square brackets, will help you kind of change the brush size. So I'm just going to kind of quickly go through and just sort of tweak this mask a bit. And when you want to switch out, you just hit X and you see the marching line, the marching ants line has changed, right? So I'll hit Q again, and I may just kind of come in here and just kind of knock some of this stuff back a little bit. So I may want to keep some of these little jagged edges that are still kind of hiding out in the shadow area. Clean up some of these messy little pixelated areas a bit as well. So again, this kind of becomes sort of like the layer mask, junk mask painting I was talking about last class. So we'll just kind of come in, yeah, just clean up some of this stuff. And you can hit Q. If you're not sure what's happening, hit Q to switch out, and then you can switch back in. And what's kind of cool about this too, like you see there's still a shadow area here. I may want to grab it so I can just kind of paint that back in. I think there's a way as well to change the color of this. So if I go to edits, I believe it's under preferences somewhere. I'll have to cycle through this a bit. Interface. Yeah, it's been a while since I've changed the color. I'm usually okay with the red, but sometimes I'll change it to like a bright green. There we go. So I think, is it brush preview color? Not sure if that's it. No. Yeah, it might be, I think maybe under color settings too, possibly. Nope. Anyways, I'll sort of dig around here. Let me just take another quick look and see. If I can't find it, I'll just move on, but was that it? No. Yeah, no, I think, was it in here? Oh yeah, if you double click the quick mask, that's it. Double click the quick mask, you can change the opacity, so it's sort of 50% now. If you want it 100%, right? When you hit Q, it'll be like solid red. So for some people that, you know, it just is more sensible to have that, or you can change this to some insane color. So when you jump into quick mask, it's super apparent what's going on, right? Alright, so back to the brush. Let me just touch up this little edge a bit. Alright. Okay, so we'll say that's good for now. There. Okay, so I'll hit Q to jump back out of that. Hit Control 0. Control 0 kind of fills the screen with the image, so it sort of will scale it to whatever the size of your workspace is. Next up, I can simply just go to Layer Mask, since this is an active selection, right? So now I've got that crack sort of visible on top of the wall. Okay, so let me just, I'll turn off my my wall here, my background wall, or my background tile. I'm going to just hit Control S. So Control S will save this PSD, but I want to save this as a TIFF. So I use the other shortcut, Alt Control S, and I'll switch over to my TIFF format. I'll turn off layers, and I'll call this crack. All right. Discard layers, LZW, that's okay, say okay. So what happens, I should mention this right now too. So what's happening is when I save this out, there's no background color right now. You can see there's sort of no it's just sort of transparent. So that checker pattern in Photoshop tells you that the background is invisible. I believe it should fill this thing with the with just the white color. So if you actually preview this image, it'll appear in white, right? So back in Maya, what I would do is, so again, this is kind of the layout here of the material. I've got it tiled as we saw a bit earlier. So this sort of middle region is fairly important. This is sort of how you see the layout of the material. So what I want to do, in fact, is kind of replace this file 2, which is, I should rename this actually. I'll call this stone tile, I guess. Stone tile. So that's the stone tile node that I have, the file node. What you can do is break the connection from the output color of this going into the input color of the material. So I'm going to just middle mouse click and drag this, or left mouse click and drag this off to break the connection. And I'll have to kind of put a little node in between this because I want to start layering textures or colors. So I'll grab the color output, middle mouse click and drag out. For some reason it doesn't always work, but if I click on the blend material, I'll try it this way. If I click on the blend material, I'll click on the little checker box, and if you scroll down, I should mention this as well. If you guys notice, there's kind of a little category section on the left-hand side. So sometimes if you can't see all these nodes, it's because you've selected some other subcategory. So just kind of keep that in mind. By default, though, Maya should kind of open up, I think it's these 4 categories. But sometimes there are other ones that you might want to use that are hidden, or you've just selected one and you're not seeing the other ones that you want to see or are used to seeing. It's because of the selection here. So I think the one I want is under Other Textures, Layered Texture. And if you just hit the broader Maya category, it shows you every single kind of specific node that you might want to use. And you can do a search as well. So you can go layered, there's layered shaders, there's layered textures, and then there's a render layered node. In this case, I want layered texture, not shader. So you see now that that kind of feeds into the color, and the color's green, because if we take a look, I kind of wish this was set up more like Photoshop, but basically these layers, this is like layer 1. There's nothing connected to layer 1. Okay. So what I have to do is feed in this this texture over here, my stone wall texture. So let me just move this out of the way for a sec. You can see my wall is just this flat green color. So what I want to do is take the output color and feed it into this input. If I kind of open up the inputs under layered texture, there's the initial input and its color swatch. So I can go output color, left click and drag to the color node, and then all of a sudden it'll kind of feed in and link up correctly. And it keeps that UV tiling that I set, because that's sort of connected right to this sandstone wall. Pretty cool. So that's it. And if you, sometimes these nodes, by the way, they can be placed over top of each other. They can kind of like be laid out weirdly. So what you can do is just kind of select everything, or even if you have nothing selected, you can hit this little button right here, which is basically to arrange the inputs and the outputs. You guys see that? So when I click on that, it's going to, it should rearrange everything. If not, I'll just select everything and hit it. There we go. So select everything, and you see it kind of arranges things a lot more neatly, right? Also, typically, if you guys are working on 2 monitors, you know, a lot of times you'd have Hypershade kind of filling up one monitor and then your main Maya workspace filling up the other. But just for the purpose of demonstration, I'll keep this window sort of floating over here. Now, the cool thing about this layer texture node, right? And you can sort of see, you hover over it, it tells you the name of it, stone tile. If I just click anywhere next to this in this little workspace area, so anywhere in this little area, it'll actually create a space for another node. So if I just left click once, you see it creates that new node. And the cool thing about this is that there's an alpha to this. So I'll show you what that sort of means in a second. So with this thing, I can, let's take a look here. I can go in and click on the checker box here, which can be easier sometimes than going through here into the kind of workspace and trying to expand the inputs, going to color, right, and then connecting something that way. So I'll go to the checker box under color here and go back to my standard. Let me clear my search results there. So I'll go to File. So you see now it's connecting to that second input. And now I have to load the crack layer. So I'll go to crack, and let's take a look. And nothing's happening, right? So you might be wondering, what the hell is going on? So one of the things that's happening is that, again, if you imagine Photoshop, right? Like whatever layer, so let me go back to Photoshop for a second. This layer underneath, right? The brick is sitting underneath as a base. And then the layer above, it has a layer mask, or what we can also call an alpha. And it's got its actual layer of color information or pixels. So whatever is kind of being punched out, which is what's here in this layer mask, that black area is being kind of knocked out, that brick, to allow the layer below to show through. In Maya, this is what I was saying, I wish it had the same layout as Photoshop. The way the layer texture system works is that your base texture, or your lowest level or lowest layer texture, or what would be at the bottom in Photoshop, is what should be on the right. So if I middle mouse click and drag the stone tile to make it the base, that crack will show up above it, right? And you see the nodes sort of swap, right? You guys see that? And again, I should rename my file to, by the way, it's always a good idea to name things uniquely in Maya, because Maya is all based on these kind of nodes in the background. I'm sure Charles probably showed you guys a bit of that, but so the node should have a fairly unique name. So I'll call this, I don't think anything else in my scene is going to be called cracks or crack. Maybe I'll call it wall crack, so it's a little more specific. So again, good habit, get in the habit of naming stuff. So there's wall crack on top. Now you see there's another problem, right? All I see is the crack. So that's one issue. So what I want to do, like Photoshop, we have blending mode, so I can switch this. So in this case, I'm seeing the crack through the layer, right? The reason for that is of the layer mask. The reason I'm not seeing it in Maya is that I don't have a layer mask, or I don't have an alpha setting for that particular node. There is this thing called an alpha. So I'll show you one way to get the white to show through, and then I'll show you another way using an alpha how we can get this to work. So right here, there's wall crack. And if I switch blending modes, let's try over. Nope. Let's see. Over. Yeah, I'm just showing you guys different modes here. There's in, out. Actually, I need to render this because I find sometimes in the viewport it doesn't actually preview. So a lot of times you have to do kind of a quick render. So I'm just going to hit the little render button. All right, so that's over. I'll do add. So what add is doing, basically any white pixels will kind of remain on top, and the black pixels will be invisible. I want the opposite of that, so I want subtract in this case. Or I'll try subtract. Let's see what happens. So again, not quite the right setting. I'll try multiply. So again, multiply, what it does is it takes the white pixels and almost allows them to act like a layer mask or an alpha. So if I hit render here, you now see the crack through the wall, right? So that works fairly well, yeah? Now, one of the other things I can do is if I don't like the placement, I can kind of go into the UV editor, right? So this is my UV editor. I'm going to just zoom out. So that's UV editor. And, oops, let's click on this object. So, yeah, let's turn off the preview. So this is where my kind of wall is sitting right now, right? And let me just turn back on the preview here. So I can try maybe inside of the crack node. Crack. So let me expand this again for you guys. So there's crack, and then there's the place 2D texture. You can try to offset this a bit. So offsetting on U. So the first number here. Sorry, let me get back over here so we can see this. There's too much going on in this small screen space, but so let's just sort of see both in one spot. So if I go to place 2D texture for the crack node, right? So I'm actually going place 2D texture for the crack node. You can go to offset. So if I offset on the first number is U, which is basically your left to right. So if I offset by like 0.5, you see it's actually going to push the crack over to the other side, right? So let me set that back to 0. I can also go to offset on V, so that's the vertical. Now 1 is like one whole offset, one whole tile offset, so you often go between 0 and 1. So let's say I go 0.2 offset, right? 0.3, 0.4. So now you're seeing the repetition of the stuff that's cut off from above. Sorry, from below. What's cut off below is repeating above now. So I usually want to avoid something like that. So I'll go 0.35, 0.31. That's not too bad, right? So I may like that kind of jagged crack. I actually kind of don't like that straight line across the top, so I'll just cut that off a little bit. So I'll go 0.29 as an offset, 0.27. So I think for me that kind of looks the best. So that's one way you can kind of play with the placement of these textures. And if we go back to the UV editor, yeah, let me just select the mesh again so we can see that. So when I'm offsetting, I just want to show you guys this in combination. So when I'm offsetting, oh, so annoying. Can't keep it visible, but so let me just take out the offset. I'll put it back to 0. So you guys see, you know, the texture sits where it should in the square workspace, but when I offset here, offset what was it? 0.27, 0.27, and then I click back on my plane, you'll see it's actually pulling that down or offsetting it down, right? So, and whatever gets kind of cut off at one side gets repeated on the opposite side. So if something gets cut off on the left side, it gets repeated over on the right. Or if it gets cut off on the right, it gets repeated on the left. If something from the top gets cut off, it gets repeated at the bottom. And vice versa. Whatever gets cut off at the bottom will show up at the top. So I'll just show you that again. Let me do another offset on this thing. Let's say minus 0.25 on the U, which is the left to right axis, right? Yeah, I want to go actually the other way. So plus, I guess, 0.25. So you see it's cut off on the one side now, right? That crack is starting to get cut off, but it'll repeat and show up on the right side. I hope that makes sense for you guys. So yeah, whatever's happening in that square UV workspace, Maya doesn't preview it automatically, and I forget where the setting is. I'll have to look this up, but technically speaking, whatever's inside this workspace is what will receive that sort of first copy of your pixels. Whatever happens outside the square workspace, it's almost like the texture is repeated infinitely to the left, to the right, above and below. So if you kind of push a tile out or offset it off to one side, it'll show up on the opposite side. So let me just fix that. Set the offset to 0. So I like the positioning, right? If I didn't like the pure kind of like super darkness to it, I could maybe try under, where is it, under layer texture here. Or sorry, I think it's under the crack color. There's alpha, oh yeah, that's not going to work. Alpha offset, alpha gain. Yeah. Yeah, in this case actually, because of the way the image is layered, I can't kind of affect the intensity or blend of that just yet. So, all right, now if I wanted to, so like I said, multiply blending mode is working well in this case. In some cases, you may need to create what's called an alpha channel. So, an alpha channel. So let me just switch the blending mode off to show you that. All right, so, oops, yeah, let's turn this to none. So this is the image as is. So what an alpha channel basically is kind of like a layer mask, but for a whole image. And if you are in Photoshop and looking at layers, you can switch to channels, and you'll see that there's actually a red, green, blue channel, which holds all the color information, but now there's actually a layer mask channel. So this is sort of temporarily hidden, but you can actually activate this, which looks like the quick mask option. And what you can do is actually duplicate the channel and just call it alpha. So if you have a layer mask from Photoshop that you want to actually be active and exported when you save a TIFF, you can simply activate. So yeah, let me just turn off my tile layer here so I only see the crack layer. Alpha is active, and Photoshop will realize that labeling or recognize that labeling. I'll do a save as TIFF. I'll save this back over, and you may notice now there's this little extra option called alpha channels. So it'll store that channel as an alpha, and we can kind of tell Maya how to use the alpha channel. So I'm just going to save this out. I'll turn off layers as well because I don't want the layers. Replace the crack. Discard layers. Yeah, I think that's okay. So let's go back in here. I'm just going to reload this texture. Now you see nothing's changed, but in this layer for the wall crack, I can click on this, do another file load, and basically reload the same file, which you see is going into this alpha, right? Hold on, let me just full screen this a bit so you guys can see this. So I'm really just going to plug this in, the same image in again. And yeah, let's go to the output and let's take a look at this. Hopefully this is going to show up. Okay. For some reason it doesn't want to work, so that's okay. In this case, the blending mode works fine, so I'm going to just leave that as is. I'll turn the blending mode back on for this. Let's do the multiply. Oh, you know what I think part of my issue was is that I had an offset. So when you have an offset, you need to duplicate your offset for your alpha. Anyways, so I'll come back to this a bit later. So the next step, so cracks can be kind of specific. I need to be in a specific spot. Let's turn this off. The next step I'm going to do, let me just turn off the, or delete this alpha channel. Delete that. So I'll try graffiti next for my next bit of damage or whatever. And then I'll just choose some sort of general kind of stains, grime. So the easier stuff to grab when in terms of graffiti is sort of stuff that's been shot straight on. Stuff that's like isolated is nice and easy to kind of grab, right? If you wanted to throw something on. And the good thing is if you've got a basic white background, it's even easier to kind of just use those blending modes to kind of take it out of the shot, or to take those kind of pixels out. Whereas this would be a little bit more of a pain. It's definitely like, it looks like it's been treated in Photoshop already, so I wouldn't want to use that. This one I wouldn't use because there's already a brick pattern showing through behind that I don't necessarily want to see. So I don't want to have kind of like two clashing layers of brick going on. So yeah, you want to be a little... That's awesome. Badly graffitied Mario. Again, there's another issue with the lines here through the graffiti, so... I like that one. That's pretty funny. Like, yeah, I'm a superstar graffiti artist. So let's just say I'll just grab kind of this one for now, I guess, for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to just copy the image. I'll paste it in. Typically what I'll do is I'll kind of get like the positioning I roughly want. So I'm going to hit Control T for my transform tool, holding Shift and Alt to scale it down a bit. Now, because this thing, if you kind of notice, it is a little gray, the pixels in this thing, and there also is a bit of a background texture to this. What I might do is just simply go to Control L, which is levels. You can get to levels also through image adjustment levels. All right, image adjustment levels. Again, I like the shortcuts, so when you kind of start picking up Photoshop, it's a good idea to kind of make note of the things that you're using a lot and learn the shortcuts. So Control L. So what I can do is kind of push maybe the lighter pixels, the darker pixels towards the lighter gray spectrum, or take the light pixels and push it all there. So I'm going to move the gray point so the gray pixels are going to get darker, so that those dark lines are going to get a little darker, a little richer. The sort of light gray pixels are going to get fairly light and white. So I want to be a little bit careful too, though, because sometimes you'll get some weird pixelation happening here. So I may just erase this or mask this part out of the layer. So I'll just say OK to this. Next up, I can switch to the Paint Bucket tool. So I'm just going to hit G for the bucket. Sometimes, though, the Paint Bucket will be in gradient mode or 3D material drop mode. So I usually will just hit Shift G, or you can left click and hold on the on that gradient tool until it switches to the Paint Bucket. And I'll just drop in some white right here. So I'm literally just filling the rest of this area with white. And then if I want to, you know, this is being kind of destructive, so I could use layer masking and stuff for this, but instead I'm just going to kind of paint stuff out, you know, that I don't want. Okay, so what I would usually do is sort of preview this in Photoshop. So I'll switch to darken. By the way, Photoshop kind of has these categorized kind of nicely. What the darken tools do is they like multiply, darken, color burn, linear burn, what they'll do is they'll take the darkest pixels and apply them against the layer underneath, but the light pixels will remain. The lighten screen dodge usually takes the lighter, oh, I don't have actually my visibility on, so let's, yeah, there we go. So just to show you, so when I go darken, the dark stuff remains, the light pixels disappear, and there's a little subtle variety between, you know, color burn, darken color, right? So those dark pixels interact with the layer underneath, the white pixels disappear. The opposite happens here, where the dark pixels kind of disappear and the white pixels remain, and the dark pixels are kind of interacting with the layer underneath. And then there's overlay, so you've kind of got a combination of the highlight, or the light pixels and the dark pixels interacting. It's just that they interact in different ways depending on the type of mixture you're getting. So darken usually works really, really well. Let me just zoom in so I can sort of see, because a lot of times you want a little bit of transparency to kind of pop through. So that's darken. Multiply, I find, works really well for this sort of stuff, so that's not too bad at all. And I could maybe play with the opacity a bit, just so it's a little more see-through, or maybe a little more faded. So something like that could work really, really well. So multiply with a little light opacity. So I'm going to just set this back to 100%. I can leave this on multiply. I'll turn off my other layer. I'm going to hit Alt-Control-S. Alt-Control-S. Come on. Alt-Control-S, there we go. So I'll save this as a, again, as a TIFF file. Call it graffiti. I'm going to discard layers again. I want to make sure they're always off. Say OK. Go back to Maya. Go back to the layered texture. Click again on this. And I'm going to plug in another file. So this kind of becomes fairly repetitive at a point, right? I'll load the graffiti here. Let's call this, again, graffiti. Wall graffiti. Okay, and then I'll go back to layered texture. I'm going to take that, oops, where are you? What are you doing? Alright, sorry, let me just rearrange the space here. Oh, I think I'm plugging this into the alpha actually by accident, so let me just delete this. Yeah, let's click on this. Let's feed this in to color. Go to file, and then I'll locate that graffiti. There we go. So I'll call that wall graffiti. Okay, and then I'll just map this whole thing out. There we go. So graffiti's sitting underneath. Again, I want this above, so I'm going to middle mouse click and drag this in between the cracks, let's say, and the wall behind. So for the wall graffiti, I'll just take the blending mode and switch it to multiply like I had in Photoshop. And alpha is kind of like your layer opacity. You guys see that? So I can, again, I found like 90%, 80% looked really, really nice. And again, if I want to offset it, I just have to go into the node for this. So let me just pop this open a bit. So for the, where is it? Graffiti, I'm going to take the place 2D node and I can offset this thing maybe like 0.3. There we go, it's not too bad. 0.25. Maybe push it off to the left a bit. So 0.1. Yeah, it's okay. 0.05. 0.2. Right? So that's pretty cool. Yeah. And the last step is pretty easy. It's actually just an overall kind of grime layer that I'm going to put. Again, I'm going to slip the grime layer just below the crack because I don't want the grime to show through in the cracks. Yes.
What was the blend mode for the crack and the graffiti?
Oh, okay. So the blend mode for the crack. Yeah, let me just take a look. I don't think I used one for the crack. Let me just see. See if I take a look at the layered texture. If I look at the crack, yeah, wall crack is actually on multiply. Graffiti is on multiply with an alpha of 0.865. Now for you guys, it's all going to be a little different. You're going to have to play with settings to get what you feel looks good. And then the base layer, there's no alpha, there's no, it's only tiled and that's it. There should actually be no blending mode there. There we go. Okay, so Again, we get this kind of nice combo. We feel like the paint hopefully is like stuck to the wall. Yeah. So that really kind of helps ground this thing a little bit. And then let's go back here. We'll take a look at, I'll take a look at just like stains, for example.
How would you go about moving the graffiti on the texture itself in mind? Just because I feel like, let's say the overlay like that, if I kind of want to move it to
Yeah, if you want to move it, it's just basically going into the hypershade, right? So what I was doing is grabbing, oops, let me just move this over. So I was grabbing the graffiti place 2D node.
oh, right, it's the opposite.
And then just, yeah, the offset. So I'd go maybe like minus 0.3, and you see it's off to the one side now, right? So you can do that as well. You can also rotate a little bit. So you see the rotation tool there. For some reason, it's like really, really limited, but you can rotate like, I could rotate 45 degrees, right? I could sort of twist it that way if I wanted to. And then I may have to tweak the offset a bit. So minus 0.25, there we go. So yeah, you can kind of place it any way you want. If you want to just leave the graffiti straight on the wall and then tweak it in Maya, that's fine. Yeah.
Can you scale it from Maya? Like, for example, you can find it where you have to go back on Photoshop and scale it.
Yeah, so if you want to shrink it down, right? So I think it's under coverage. I think you go, let's say 0.75, but you see it does this weird kind of like adjustment to the layering and stuff. So I think if we, yeah, no, wrapping is not going to help. Let's see. Yeah, for this, I would suggest, like, if you really want to scale it down, maybe just stick to Photoshop for that, because for some reason, DV kind of wants to show through. So, yeah, just be a little bit careful of the, I guess, the tiling or coverage. So coverage is sort of like how much of the image is sort of shown or how much of the image is being used as a percentage. I don't find it super precise, so, yeah, I'd be probably more inclined. You could try UV repeat, but then there's another problem. So if I repeat this, let's say 2 times, then I get like multiple copies, which I don't necessarily want. So sometimes you could play with that number a bit. 0.15, 0.15. I'm getting a little repeat in the upper corner, so I could just offset this 0.3. Nope. 0.1. There we go. And then maybe offset minus 0.3 here. But again, I'm kind of getting repeating in other spots. So for me, you know, if you want to kind of get this set right, I would just fix it in Photoshop or scale it down in Photoshop, if that answers your question, I hope. Yeah, 3D Max actually does a really good job of this offsetting. I'd have to look into it. There's probably some other issue here with the layers or the alphas or something, but or maybe it's, I guess that multiply mode might be having an impact too. Anyway, so yeah, this works fairly well. The last step is this kind of grime layer, so let me just hide this off. So I'll call this graffiti, of course. So I'll find some really disgusting looking stains. Now, a lot of times what you would see on a wall, if this is a wall, would be like these kind of long dripping kind of water stains, right? Now again, this has other kind of stone masonry texture on top. This might be kind of cool because it's sort of adding or indicating some crack lines and some chips. And if you also notice, I'm not paying as much attention to the harsh shading and highlight in this, mainly because, you know, it's there to add a bit of noise and a bit of chaos. So I might in fact try this. Let me just see what this looks like in here. So I'll turn off that graffiti layer. Or, you know, let me just see it in combination actually. So I'll slip the graffiti under the cracks. This I may lay on top of everything but the cracks as well. And then I'll just switch to different blending modes. Multiply. Oftentimes multiply with opacity looks kind of cool. Color burn. The lighten section, so this is kind of the lightening, brightening section. Not always great. Overlay can be really, really good sometimes, but it sort of also punches up the brightness of the pixels underneath, so I'm not totally crazy about that. Soft light and hard light are really good for just like a subtle effect. Yeah. I think I'll probably go again with the multiply for this. Like, it just looks good and grimy. And if you want to adjust it, so if it's darkening the layers behind too much, you can hit Control L again, which is your levels, and kind of brighten that overall layer. Maybe play with the midtones a bit as well. So If I move the midtones to the left, what I'm kind of saying is more of these dark gray and black pixels are going to be pushed to the middle gray. If I go the opposite way, we're taking more of the dark stuff and or the medium to light gray stuff, we're making it darker. So yeah, sometimes a little adjustment like that can be really, really useful. Yeah, that's not terrible. The other thing I noticed is I just kind of caught it out of the corner of my eye. If I zoom out, this layer you see is not quite fully covering the image area. So I want to just hold shift and I'm going to scale this thing out a bit. So I've got coverage all across the board. And I may hit Control T again just to kind of slide this thing around to find an area that maybe looks a little more interesting and better. Okay, so I'll turn this off. I'll turn off the other layers. And I'll hit Alt Control S to save out the final layer. And this will be, I'll just call it grime or stains. Now, I kind of mentioned this briefly, but there are stains, like very, very common wall stains are called water stains usually. So what happens is you'll see like water running down. I think I've got some better ones actually in the texture library. There's some pretty good stuff in there for stains and damage, but if you look at maybe like brick. Yeah, you guys sort of see this. I don't know how visible that is, but sometimes you'll get under windows like runoff of water that is kind of constantly happening. And yeah, let me just maybe look up something else here. Change my search terms. Building facade. Let's do that.
Hey, how do you see the preview of the texture node in Maya? Like it's stuck on another file and I want to have final result.
Well, you should have 6 is the material preview, but sometimes with layered textures, it doesn't always display properly. But yeah, if you hit 6 or if it's layered correctly, if you don't have the blending mode turned on, switch the blending mode on, it should display. So I'll show you that in a second. But yeah, it's too bad. I'm trying to. Okay, here we go. This is like a perfect example. So you'll sort of see like grime and dirt and stuff wear down, usually from the corners of windows, sometimes in the underledge of windows as well. So those are kind of like typical water stains. So yeah, sometimes you may want like a long dripping pattern for your staining if you want, for your walls. For floors, it would be something different, right? Here we go. So there's also some other like sort of staining effects, kind of splotchiness too. So there's all sorts of things that can happen to an environment. So let me just go to my layer texture. I'm going to left click again, create a new spot for a new node. Click on that layer, go to File, and I'm going to load up the grime, right? And if I don't see anything yet, I basically have to rearrange the ordering. So I'm going to go Layered Texture again. Middle mouse click and drag that layer so it's just below the cracks. So if you're only seeing that layer, it's usually because you haven't switched blending mode. So I'm going to switch to Multiply, right? And so now all this stuff really helps to break up the kind of repetition. So that's kind of the point of this project, is to sort of show you guys in a nutshell some texturing fundamentals, but also how you can use basics like tiling and also layered materials to kind of break up any repetition, repeating, patterning. So textures can get infinitely more complex and more layered than this in production, but this is sort of a good overview, I guess, of what you would do in a production type environment. Again, I should name my node just to finish this out. So I'm going to grab all of this and hit the Arrange button so I order things a little better. So what I've got here, grime. Call this wall grime. I'll play a little bit with the opacity of that layer. Oops. So I'll grab that layer and just adjust its kind of alpha, I guess, for that layer. There we go. So it's a little more subtle, maybe not so stuck on, right? So yeah, that's basically it. You would save your Maya file, include your originals that you downloaded, include the edited versions and the PSD for this file submission, and that's basically your assignment 1. So do you guys have any questions or no? Hopefully everybody's good. I'll put this video up immediately so you guys will have access to it.